The nation unveils its ambition to build a triangular cluster for space technology encompassing Daejeon, Jeollanam-do, and Gyeongsang-nam-do provinces. Visiting the space stronghold city of Sacheon today, President Yoon vowed to expand the country's space-related budget by 2027. Medical professors from 19 universities across the country formed a joint emergency committee to discuss whether to submit their resignations en masse by later this week to protest the government's reform plan. The government is set to go ahead with its original plan to expand the medical school quota. More than 300,000 jobs were added last month in Korea, driven by elderly workers and sectors such as public administration and IT. It's March 13th, 2024. This is Newscenter. Good evening. Thank you for joining us. I'm Yoon Jung-min. We begin with South Korea's vision to become a major space power. Today, the nation launched a so-called Space Tech Triangle, a cluster of research institutes and companies to produce cutting-edge space technology centered around three key areas in the nation. President Yoon Suk-yeol pledged funding worth millions of dollars for it. Oh Soo-young has more.
President Yoon Suk-yeol promises to invest over $1 billion in space technology over the next 3 years as part of South Korea's efforts to become a leading space power by 2045. This came on Wednesday as the president attended the launch of a space cluster in Sacheon City, Gyeongsang-nam-do province, which will form the so-called Space Triangle with Jeollanam-do province and Daejeon City.
2032년 우리 탐사선을 달에 착륙시키고 2045년 화성에 태극기를 꽂는 미래로의 큰 걸음을 내딛게 됩니다. 오늘 출범하는 우주산업 클러스터가 앞으로 그 길을 선도하게 될 것입니다.
According to Korea Aerospace Research Institute, the cluster will connect research centers, firms, and educational institutions to achieve cutting-edge innovations. Gyeongsang-nam-do will focus on satellites, Jeollanam-do launch vehicles, while research and training experts will be done in Daejeon, the country's hub for science and technology. Laying out the vision of turning South Korea into one of the world's top 5 space powers and creating a vibrant space industry, Yoon said he would expand the budget for space development to $1.1 billion by 2027, double the amount of private funding, and create over 250,000 quality jobs. The government's 2045 plan aims to build a space industry worth $76 billion of private investments, attract and foster 1,000 space firms in the country, and nurture 30,000 space professionals. It will focus on establishing infrastructure, strengthening a space tech ecosystem, and expanding the new space cluster's networking capacity. To coordinate these efforts, the government will launch a South Korean equivalent of NASA in Sacheon City in May, which will lead aeronautics and space research, commercial projects, and plans for Moon and Mars explorations. The Korea Aerospace Administration, or KASA, is expected to work with other global space agencies like NASA, with discussions already underway between Seoul and Washington to apply South Korea's mobility, secondary battery, 5G, self-driving, and nuclear technologies in joint space exploration projects. Korea is already taking part in the US-led Artemis project, which will send a SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket to the moon later this year, equipped with a Korean-made lunar monitoring payload. Seoul has also agreed to expand space cooperation with the United Kingdom, the United Arab Emirates, Japan and France. Oh Soo-young, Arirang News.
Yet another medical crisis is now looming as professors of medicine nationwide are considering collective resignations against the government's reform plan in solidarity with junior doctors. The government is set to go ahead with its plan to expand the medical school quota. Shin Se-byuk reports.
The massive walkout by junior doctors could soon expand to collective resignations by professors of medicine. An emergency response committee of professors from 19 medical schools across the country decided in a late-night online meeting on Tuesday to determine by Friday whether to submit collective resignation letters. Those schools include those affiliated with the so-called Big Five hospitals in Seoul, Seoul National, Yonsei Severance, and the Seoul St. Mary's Catholic University hospitals and the Samsung and Seoul Asan medical centers. In a statement released after the meeting, the professor said they would protect the trainee doctors from legal action by the government. They also said they would stop the government's plan to expand the medical school quota. In response, Second Health Vice Minister Park Min-soo urged the professors on Wednesday to stay in their positions, saying this was a matter of trust between patients and doctors.
If professors resign and leave patients behind, not only doctors, but also medical students will lose any sympathy from the people.
On the same day, Prime Minister Han Duck-soo reaffirmed the government's firm stance on boosting the medical school quota, saying the decision was made based on scientific analysis.
The decision made by the government was based on scientific grounds. We have decided to increase enrollment by 2,000 starting from 2025, taking into account the time required for medical training.
The government, meanwhile, will provide nearly 95 billion won, or over $72 million, to public hospitals this year to address the prolonged disruption of medical services. This comes as delays in surgeries and emergency medical treatment since the massive walkout by trainee doctors. Meanwhile, Kim Taek-woo, the chairman of the Emergency Response Committee of the Korean Medical Association, underwent 14 hours of police questioning from Tuesday afternoon. Kim is one of 5 individuals the health ministry accused on February 27th of obstructing junior doctors' training through inciting of their mass walkout. After questioning, he said the government's strong stance was regrettable and the walkout by the trainee doctors was entirely voluntary. The current situation, sparked by the government's plan to increase medical school enrollment by 2,000, has been ongoing for 4 weeks. 신세벽, Arirang News.
South Korea's Freedom Shield exercise with the U.S. is well underway. Today, the nation's defense chief was at some of the sites where the exercise is taking place, saying he wants Korea's forces to become capable of quickly eliminating the North Korean leadership if it starts a war. Our defense correspondent, Choi Min-jung, has more.
South Korea's special forces have been taking part in the Seoul-Washington Freedom Shield exercise since last Friday. Forces from the two sides have mastered advanced combat techniques like infiltrating key enemy facilities. South Korea's defense chief Shin Won-sik inspected the Army Special Warfare Command on Wednesday and stressed that the special forces must become the world's strongest with the ability to quickly eliminate the enemy's leadership if Kim Jong-un starts a war. Shin inspected another site of the Freedom Shield exercise, the United States Forces Korea's military bunker complex, CP Tango. This is where the KoreaUS Combined Forces Command directs the ground, sea, and air operations in times of emergency. The defense chief vowed efforts to promptly neutralize North Korean nuclear and missile threats. Meanwhile, on Wednesday, South Korea's Air Force conducted air interdiction drills. The training was aimed at improving pilot skill in responding to various threats, including high-speed infiltration by enemy fighter jets, surface-to-air provocations, as well as cruise missile launches. Around 20 fighter jets and reconnaissance aircraft, including the F-35A, F-15K, and KF-16, took part.
Training in the air is more tense than when on the ground because we must always be prepared against the enemy's surface-to-air and air-to-air threats and constantly check fuel consumption status. We are training with all our hearts so that we can protect our troops and our people from enemy attacks in a time of emergency.
South Korea and the U.S. began their annual Freedom Shield exercise on March 4th to bolster defense capabilities against evolving North Korean nuclear and missile threats. The exercise will run until Thursday. Choi Min-jung, Arirang News.
Amid the Russian presidential election nearing, its President Vladimir Putin insists that the country is technically ready for a nuclear war, taking aim at the West. He also said North Korea has its own nuclear umbrella and that Pyongyang has not asked Moscow for any help. Our foreign affairs correspondent Bae Yoon-ji tells us more.
Russian President Vladimir Putin says the country is technically ready for nuclear war in a strong warning against the West. He told the country's Russia 1 television and news agency RIA on Wednesday that Russia would be ready to use nuclear weapons if its sovereignty was threatened. He said the U.S. understands that if it deploys American troops in Ukraine, Russia would see the move as an intervention. While adding that if the U.S. conducted nuclear tests, Russia might do the same, he said Moscow is not rushing toward nuclear confrontation, and that he sees no need for the use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine. On North Korea, he said the regime has its own nuclear umbrella, stressing that Pyongyang has not asked Moscow for any help.
President Putin's remarks were to indirectly emphasize that the development of North Korea's nuclear capabilities is based on the North's own technology, not the technical assistance from Russia.
This comes just 3 days before Russia's presidential election, which will take place for 3 days starting March 15th. The election will likely give President Putin, who's seeking a fifth term, another 6 years in power until 2030. 배은지, Arirang News.
Over in the U.S., President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump clinched their party's presidential nominations on Tuesday local time. Their rematch in November is now certain as widely expected. Jung-Ju has the latest.
President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump both clinched their party's nomination on Tuesday, kicking off the first U.S. presidential election rematch in nearly 70 years. Biden needed 1,968 delegates to win the nomination, and he passed that number on Tuesday night as results came in from primary contests in Georgia, Mississippi, and Washington state, and Democrats living abroad. Trump clinched the 1,215 delegates required to secure the Republican presidential nomination after 4 states held contests, including Georgia, the battleground where he faces criminal charges. The outcome of Tuesday's voting was essentially predetermined after former UN Ambassador Nikki Haley, Trump's last remaining rival, ended her presidential campaign after losing 14 states to him on Super Tuesday. Trump, however, is facing 91 felony counts in 4 criminal cases involving his handling of classified documents and his attempt to overturn the 2020 election, among other alleged crimes. Biden, meanwhile, is dealing with increased pressure from liberal activists frustrated by support for Israel's war in Gaza. At 81, Biden is already the oldest president in U.S. history and is also working to assure a skeptical electorate that he's still physically and mentally able. President Biden has also come under scrutiny following the release of special counsel Robert Hur's report, which concluded that Biden mishandled and improperly disclosed classified information after leaving the vice presidency. But no charges were filed with Hur, who testified Tuesday on Capitol Hill, saying he didn't believe there was enough evidence to charge Biden with the crime. President Biden and Trump's rematch will be the first featuring 2 U.S. presidents since 1912. And both men have already turned their attention to the November general election. Jung-Ju, Arirang News.
More jobs were added yet again in Korea last month, driven by elderly workers and sectors like public administration and IT. In fact, the nation's employment rate was the highest for any February. Park Go-nu covers the latest findings.
South Korea's job figures jumped by over 300,000 on year for the second consecutive month in February. According to data released by Statistics Korea on Wednesday, 329,000 jobs were added to the total employment figure last month, compared to a year before, bringing the total working population aged 15 and above to over 28 million. The employment rate rose 0.5 percentage points from the year before to 61.6% last month, the highest for any February since related data was first compiled in 1982. February's unemployment rate was 3.2%, a 0.1 percentage point jump from the year before.
In February, ongoing increases in total employment were seen with additions in sectors including public administration, IT, and science.
Manufacturing was another area where jobs were added for the 3rd straight month, while the agriculture and fisheries, education, and real estate sectors all saw decreases. Those aged 60 and above mainly drove the increase, with nearly 300,000 additions to the workforce from that age group in February. There was also an increase in the number of workers in their 30s and in their 50s. Groups including those aged 15 through 29 and people in their 40s saw job figures fall on year by more than 60,000 each last month. Park Go-nu, Arirang News.
Extravagant wedding costs and the lack of information have been cited as one reason behind consumers complaining. The authorities are now making the information more transparent. Lee Soo-jin has details.
South Korea will make it mandatory for wedding-related businesses to disclose their prices starting next year to improve transparency in the wedding industry. That's according to plans targeted toward young South Koreans announced during an emergency economic meeting led by Finance Minister Choi Sang-mok on Wednesday.
In the wedding sector, measures are being prepared to make it mandatory for businesses to provide information on prices for marriage-related goods and services that consumers can easily understand.
High wedding costs have plagued prospective couples for a while now, with numerous accounts of overspending due to the lack of information about various wedding services. To address this, the government will from next year require firms to disclose prices of wedding-related goods and services, such as dress and venue rentals and wedding photography, on the Korea Consumer Agency website. And in a move to further mitigate the price burden for prospective couples, the government is adding museums such as the National Museum of Korea and the National Library of Korea to the list of 120 public facilities already being used as wedding venues. The government also plans to revise regulations in new industries such as fintech and robotics. In Wednesday's meeting, the finance minister announced plans to allow individuals to not just send Korean won, but also foreign-denominated currencies to others through prepaid electronic payment services, allowing people to more easily split the bill when traveling abroad. The government will also establish internal guidelines to allow the South Korean police to use patrol robots, as other countries have already begun deploying them to improve public safety. Lee Soo-jin, Arirang News.
Starting Thursday, mobile users will receive a subsidy of up to 500,000 Korean won, or around $380 when switching mobile carriers. The Korea Communications Commission passed a proposal on Wednesday regarding the criteria for providing subsidies when changing phone numbers during a switch of mobile carriers. This follows the amendment to the Enforcement Decree of the Mobile Device Distribution Act last Friday, aiming to activate market competition to lower handset prices. Also, the frequency of changes to publicly announced subsidies, previously limited to twice a week, will now be changed to once a day. The net inflow of foreign investment on the local bourse last month was the largest seen in more than a decade. Data from the Bank of Korea on Wednesday shows that foreign investors bought a net worth of around $5.6 billion of local shares in February. That's the largest amount seen since 2013. The Bank of Korea attributed this to optimistic forecasts for local chip makers, as well as expected returns from the Corporate Value Up program unveiled last month. The total net inflow of foreign investment in stocks and bonds amounted to $8.1 billion. U.S. inflation rose higher than expected in February ahead of Federal Reserve's rate decision next week. In the meantime, the S&P 500 climbed to a new all-time high. Lee Seung-jae has more.
According to the U.S. Commerce Department's Bureau of Labor Statistics on Tuesday, the U.S. Consumer Price Index rebounded slightly in February and remained stagnant in the low 3% range. The latest data showed that U.S. CPI rose 3.2% compared to the same month a year ago and was up 0.4% from the previous month. U.S. inflation peaked at 9.1% in June 2022 and has since slowed down, fluctuating in the low to mid 3% range since June 2023. Meanwhile, excluding volatile food and energy prices, core CPI rose 0.4% in February, up 3.8% on year. Both were slightly higher than market expectations. The increase in energy and shelter prices accounted for more than 60% of the total gain. However, despite the slight rise in the U.S. consumer prices and the prospect of the U.S. Fed freezing its key rates further, Wall Street reacted positively to the latest CPI data, with the S&P 500 climbing to a new all-time high during Tuesday's trading session. The S&P 500 rose more than 1% on the day to close at 5,175.27, breaking the previous high set just 3 sessions ago. The Dow Jones ended trading up 0.61%, while the tech-heavy Nasdaq rose over 1.5%. According to a senior investment strategist at U.S. Bank Wealth Management, rising inflation is an indication that consumers are doing well and that the slight rise in the CPI isn't affecting investor sentiment. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
Global superstar BTS Jungkook, Standing Next to You, the third release from his debut solo album Golden, has stayed on the U.S. Billboard's Hot 100 main singles chart for 18 consecutive weeks. This makes him the second longest charting K-pop solo artist after Psy, whose Gangnam Style was on the chart for 31 straight weeks in 2012. Jungkook's other songs have enjoyed significant popularity as well. His collaboration with American singer-songwriter Charlie Puth, Left and Right, stayed on the chart for 17 straight weeks, while his debut solo single 7, also from Golden, charted for 15 weeks. My Name is Lo Kiwan, a South Korean Netflix movie starring actor Song Joong-ki, has topped the company's most viewed non-English movies list. The global streaming service announced on Wednesday that from March 4th until the 10th, the movie recorded over 5.1 million views, sitting on top of the weekly top 10 list. The movie also sits in the top 10 rankings in over 30 countries across the Americas, Europe, Africa, and Asia. The drama tells the story of North Korean defector Kiwan, struggling to settle down in Belgium yet eager to survive, meeting with Mary, played by Choi Sung-eun, who has lost hope in life, and their fight for a better future together. With clear skies across the country today, the sunny weather made it feel more like spring. And tomorrow we'll be able to enjoy the spring weather, especially during the day. But there are also areas where caution is needed due to strong winds. From the afternoon, winds have been strengthening gradually in the central region, inland areas of Gyeongsang-Bukdo province, and on the east coast. In particular, as the atmosphere is gradually drying up on the east coast, there's a high risk of fire accidents. Please take extra precautions. From tonight, smoke from overseas is expected to gradually flow in, including in the Seoul metropolitan area. The air quality will worsen overnight, and tomorrow, the concentration of ultrafine dust will increase across the country, except for the Jeollado provinces and Gyeongsang-Namdo province, where a fine dust mask will be a must. Tomorrow, Seoul, Daejeon, Gwangju, and Gyeongju will start off at 2 degrees Celsius. Daily highs will move up to 15 in Chuncheon and Seoul, Daegu and Gyeongju, 18 degrees Celsius. Temperatures will continue to rise. On the weekend, daytime temperatures in Seoul will rise to 16 degrees, making it feel like April. That's all for Korea. Here are the weather conditions around the world. And that is Newscenter for tonight. Thank you for watching. A panel session coming up.
Welcome. 엄청난 에너지를 춤으로 뿜어내는 나라. 감당할 수 있겠니? 한국에 오면 먹어야죠. 먹어도 끝이 없는 나라. 감당할 수 있겠니?
It also remains committed to boosting Korea's ties with its global partners on the sidelines of this latest.
To discuss the current security environment.
The United Nations most powerful body on global security, expressing hope stock markets around the world have economic
ค่ะ
North Korea has taken the world by surprise with its major policy shift in unification and its recharacterization of South Korea. Now, the world's most isolated state is reopening its borders to the outside world, diversifying its diplomatic channels. As experts decode Pyongyang's latest diplomatic moves, Washington analyzed that North Korea has no intention to return to denuclearization talks, signaling a possible change in its North Korea policy. Shifting dynamics on the Korean peninsula, that's the topic of today's Within the Frame. I'm Han-dan in Seoul, and with me here in the studio are Ko Myung-hyun, Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for National Security Strategy. Great to have you back.
Thanks for having me.
And Shreyas Reddy, correspondent at NK News Seoul. Welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start with you, Shreyas. So the South Korea-U.S. joint drill, dubbed the Freedom Shield exercise, it's been held for the past 10 days and is nearing its end. But unlike previous years, North Korea is yet to carry out missile provocations. What could be some possible reasons?
Well, as with many things related to North Korea, a lot depends on whom you ask about this. So there have been some theories going that perhaps North Korea might be running low on missiles or prioritizing where it's allocating them. And some reasons people have suggested for that include maybe they're selling a lot of them to Russia and so are prioritizing that. Others are saying maybe they're reallocating them closer to the border areas as they continue their fortifications. Or maybe they're just running low. But at the same time, what North Korea has an entirely different take on it, where they came out with a statement saying the reason they're not going to respond to the exercise in the same way this time is because their soldiers have more important things to do with economic construction projects. And obviously, as with many North Korean state media statements, you have to take it with a pinch of salt, because we know that North Korea typically reacts to these exercises with a lot of bluster, and even in that statement, they still criticized the exercises as provocations, framing them as war drills against North Korea, and said that the US and South Korea would pay a dear price for that. And at the same time, I think we should also note that yes, they haven't launched ballistic missiles like in the past, but it's not like there has been no military response.
Right.
Even if the soldiers are supposedly busy with construction projects, they were clearly able to deploy them for artillery drills, which Kim Jong-un himself oversaw last week. And essentially these long-range artillery drills took place near the border, and they framed it as an exercise that with Seoul in sight, to Seoul essentially in range of those artillery drills. And so that was one aspect. And South Korea's military also said that they detected North Korean attempts to jam navigation, US and South Korean navigation systems during the drills, and seemingly there hasn't really been any impact on the drills. They've continued as normal, but it's clear that North Korea is at least acting in some way, even if it's not the way we've come to expect.
Well, some experts also analyze that it's a carefully calculated move, not making any missile provocations, considering the two sessions that were held in China that just wrapped up, and also Russia's upcoming presidential election. So Kim Jong-un probably didn't want to interrupt the major political events in China or Russia, the two most important partners of North Korea. And I think that's also one way of looking at it. Dr. Ko, a North Korean delegation led by North Korea's foreign minister, Vice Foreign Minister Bang Myung-ho has recently visited Mongolia, making a rare overseas trip for the first time in several years. And North Korean delegations, they also visited several other countries as well, not only to countries that are traditionally close to North Korea, but also others, including Brazil and Kenya. Could you walk us through some of the main events that we need to know during their visits, and also why do you think Pyongyang is pushing for these rare overseas trips now at this particular time?
Well, North Korea is clearly aiming at expanding its public diplomacy sphere. Clearly, they are visiting Mongolia for mostly to talk about raising the typical level of cooperation, economic domain and political domain. But I would say that overall, what North Korea is doing is a manifestation of two things. There's expression of confidence. I think the fact that North Korea has established very close strategic cooperative relationship with Russia has given confidence or empowered North Korea to be more outgoing, more active in their diplomatic sphere. But also, actually, it's a reflection of lack of confidence. There's a contradiction there because we have to remember that only last year, it was reported that North Korea was scaling down its diplomatic presence around the world. So North Korea normally operates up to 50 or so diplomatic sites, including consulates and embassies. But then it was reported that North Korea will be shutting down dozens of them, especially in diplomatic sites located in third world countries in the global south, such as Africa and Latin America. But now that North Korea is reaching out to precisely in countries that are located in the global south, we see a contradiction there. And I think that one of the motivations could have been the establishment of foreign relations between South Korea and Cuba. I think Cuba has for a long time been a historical ally, a close friend of North Korea. And I think this sudden establishment of diplomatic relations probably has shocked the North Korean regime that in fact, it's isolated, and then it's isolated because it's been focusing too much in improving and upgrading the relationship they already have with China and Russia. So I think it has reminded North Korea of the historical importance of the non-aligned movement, which are essentially the idea that these are countries that are aligned neither with the United States nor China. I think this is the idea that probably has getting more impetus, and I think that this is the reason why North Korea is reaching out again to countries like Mongolia. And Mongolia is a very important neighbor to North Korea. And I think if North Korea would like to see distancing relationship between their country and Mongolia precisely at this point when Cuba has normalized its diplomatic relations with South Korea.
So South Korea's forming diplomatic ties with Cuba may have played a big part, and it's also a way of North Korea presenting its confidence on the global stage, which we could also sense a bit of insecurity, but that's somewhere along the lines that you read it. Now, Shreyas, Germany has recently made an inspection at its embassy in Pyongyang, although it says no decision has been made yet on whether the embassy will reopen. Meanwhile, the UN has also appointed a UN resident coordinator for North Korea. And pundits point to, like Dr. Go has just pointed out, they point to South Korea's forming of diplomatic ties with Cuba, as well as its new two-state approach, completely separating itself from South Korea as some of the reasons behind Pyongyang's recent active engagement with the West. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think there are lots of different aspects to explore here. The first of which, of course, is when we're talking about active engagement, it's all relative, right? If we compare it to the pandemic era, obviously everything has shot up a lot. But in some ways, it's more like a resumption or moving gradually toward the sort of engagement that they had with some of these countries in the past. Germany and even other European countries like Sweden, for example, which has long been a very valuable intermediary between the West and North Korea. These are the kinds of countries with which North Korea has had relatively neutral relations compared to a lot of other Western powers. So, so for them at the moment, if they are going to start letting Western countries back in, I think countries like Germany would be more acceptable. It's something that would work better for them, but it's more like gradually restoring what was already there. And so I think that is a big factor. Obviously, it is still significant. This isn't to say that it's not. I think any engagement given North Korea's current diplomatic approach, is going to be very important, and there's certainly been a silence from them, a prolonged silence from them on multiple fronts. So a lot of these countries, they have been waiting a long time to go back in, and now at least there's some signs of hope that it could start happening this year. But at the same time, it's still North Korea is going to be very selective with whom it allows back into the country, and whom it's willing to engage with. Just because they're willing to talk to Germany does not mean, for example, they'd be willing to talk to the US or some other NATO members with which it is more likely to disagree. And also in terms of UN operations, there are some UN operations Pyongyang does consider very valuable to its needs. It's more likely to perhaps, it might be a little more receptive to, let's say, health or UNICEF operations, although at the moment even they're still waiting to hear back, than it might be some others. Even the new UN resident coordinator, for example, initially he's going to be working out of Bangkok. So it's not something that, at the moment, I think we have a reason to be hopeful, but let's perhaps not expect too much just yet. It'll take time. But also just touching upon something that Dr. Go raised earlier, a lot of North Korea's engagement right now, it's something that they kind of signaled, Kim Jong-un signaled in the end-of-year party plenum in December, when they kind of said, we're going to prioritize relations with socialist countries and non-aligned countries, and I think, or as they put it, anti-imperialist countries. And in a sense, that isn't so much a fundamental change, it's more a back-to-basics approach. While Kim Jong-un has distanced himself from his grandfather and father's approach to unification and some economic policies, he has, in some ways, this is going back to Kim Il-sung's initial diplomatic strategy, which was very much focused on the global south. And so in some ways, North Korea is now looking to these other smaller partners that they still had relations with them in the past, but perhaps to some extent now it's going to prioritize them a little more, even as it's shutting its embassies in many of these countries, perhaps financial reasons, perhaps for other political reasons. But the visits like the one to Mongolia show that it is looking to diversify its diplomatic engagement, even as in some other ways it is shifting away from perhaps dealing with some of the countries which have a bigger stake in North Korean affairs.
So you've mentioned that we perhaps shouldn't be reading too much into this. It may just be gradually returning to pre-pandemic normalcy, and that North Korea also pointing out that it's just a selective few that North Korea is reopening borders to. But do you think that perhaps this Pyongyang's push to reopen diverse diplomatic channels also has to do with Trump's possible comeback? Because some pundits say that North Korea is trying to present itself as, again, a separate state from South Korea and re-engage in talks with Trump, the U.S. Again, what do you say to this?
So I think there's definitely no doubt that North Korea will be keeping a close eye on the U.S. election, and particularly Trump. But at the same time, it's something that they do anyway. And typically what happens in U.S. election years is, unless there's someone particularly objectionable, they will avoid commenting on the frontrunners, avoid commenting on the candidates until something becomes clear. And so I think but at the same time, North Korea, they definitely know they won't be able to deal with Biden. Biden has made that abundantly clear many times. So perhaps they would definitely be hopeful for a Trump return. At the very least, there might be scope for engagement. Who knows, they might even hope to get something concrete out of it. But for them, it's definitely going to be something that they're not going to put all their eggs in this one basket. They also still have bad memories of the Hanoi summit, right. And they know that Trump is one man. He is willing to go outside the system at times. He's willing to do things at a personal level more than most US presidents, but there's still a system that could oppose them from getting the long-term results. So right now, at the moment, Trump is going to be a big factor. It's something that they're going to be watching. But for them, it's more about the possibility that having Trump, even whether or not they get something out of him if he gets elected, he might be less inclined to work with South Korea and Japan than Biden is, because at the moment, none of those three administrations is on the same page as North Korea, even if the Japanese Prime Minister says he's willing to have a summit. So I think that trilateral alliance is one factor, and Trump's more individualistic personality is something that North Korea will be keeping an eye on. But at the same time, they're going to continue with their wider diplomatic shift on their own terms, while keeping a big gap in that corner to see what happens in the US.
All right, our next question is going to be a bit of a lengthy one. Dr. Go, a U.S. intelligence office has released a report assessing North Korea's nuclear threats. It said that North Korea has no will to return to denuclearization talks and is now seeking acceptance as a nuclear state with the help of Russia. And this while Chief of the U.S. Forces Korea, Paul LaCamera, said that his strategy of deterring North Korea's nuclear threats has shifted from preventing development of nuclear weapons to now to preventing the use of nuclear weapons, which sounds a lot more threatening. Is Washington taking steps to recognize North Korea as a nuclear state?
Well, I wouldn't think so. The reason is that clearly we are talking about, so let's address the second part of your question about General LaCamera, the commander of the USFK here in Korea. And even though he's a four-star general, he actually belongs to the U.S. Army. He's under the control of the Department of Defense. So his duty is to come out with a practical response to actual threats. Whereas what North Korea aspires to do right now, either through the standing shoulder to shoulder with Russia, a nuclear state, and be perceived as a nuclear state by precisely being like being a partner of Russia, which is to acknowledge as a nuclear state, also by the United States eventually. That happens to be a diplomatic move. So that'll be under the purview of the State Department or the U.S. President, for instance. So the U.S. general talking about taking practical steps to prevent North Korea from using nuclear weapons, which is essentially a basic definition of deterrence, is essentially a responsible thing to do, in my view. So it's quite different from, say, like the State Secretary, for instance, Tony Blinken or the President Biden commenting on this issue and say that U.S. policy has shifted on North Korea, has shifted more from denuclearization to deterrence. That'll actually represent a huge step in terms of changing the orientation of U.S. policy towards North Korea. So I think this is the reason why I wouldn't read too much into what General LaCamera said. So what General LaCamera has just said is essentially a recognition of what the practical steps that the alliance is taking right now to prevent North Korea from, or dissuading North Korea from using nuclear weapons, or even if we are even lucky with this, then eventually dissuade North Korea from even issuing threats of using nuclear weapons. So, and then for that, it requires the use of a huge amount of deterrence measures, and that's exactly what the alliance is doing right now. For instance, by carrying out the annual joint military exercise, Freedom Shield. So, and then addressing the first part of your question about North Korea aspiring to be acknowledged as a nuclear state by standing shoulder to shoulder with Russia, it's all about the perception. I think North Korea wants to play with the perception of the global community and the opinion that by being with Russia in this case, and also talking about nuclear weapons as equals with a nuclear power such as Russia, I think North Korea wants to create the perception that the North Korea's possession of nuclear weapons is actually normal. So essentially trying to normalize itself in the view of the global opinion. And it's a diplomatic move after all. And I think this is the reason why North Korea wants President Vladimir Putin of Russia to reciprocate the visit to Pyongyang, which the Russian president has promised several times, but has yet to be done. So I think if that indeed happens, then North Korea would perceive such a move as a recognition of North Korea as a nuclear state, as well as a recognition of North Korea as a regional power based on the fact that it possesses nuclear weapons.
And just this afternoon, we heard that President Putin has said North Korea has its own nuclear umbrella, and it did not ask for any help from Russia. How do you interpret this?
So I think this is a gesture towards North Korea. I think Putin is fully aware of what North Korea wants to get from Russia, which is acknowledgement of North Korea's nuclear state. But I don't think Russia is ready to give that to North Korea yet. Clearly, that's a huge step forward, even though it's very symbolic. And then also it really threatens, undermines Russia's status as P5 or the permanent members of the Security Council, which is based on the fact that there are only 5 countries in the world that are officially allowed to possess nuclear weapons. So by recognizing North Korea as another nuclear state, will completely undermine the status of Russia as an official nuclear state. So I don't think Russia is ready yet, and it's not ready yet to grant that status or recognition to North Korea. But at the same time, Putin depends on North Korea for the progress being made on the Ukraine war front. So for the munition assistance and other types of weapons assistance, Russia needs North Korea's goodwill. So essentially, Putin is throwing a bone towards North Korea, but at the same time, it's remaining ambiguous when it comes to granting North Korea the nuclear state status. So I think Putin is doing a good job with playing with ambiguity. That's his time.
All right, we have a lot more grounds to cover tonight, but we are a little pressed on time. So one final question for you, Mr. Reddy. Seoul's foreign ministry plans to scale back a bureau that has been handling North Korea's nuclear issue for the past 2 decades. And also, there's been some changes in Washington as well. The title Deputy Assistant Secretary for East Asia given to Jungkook was renamed as U.S. Senior Official for North Korea. What significance does this hold? What does this imply?
Well, in terms of the title, so this is something that I've spoken to U.S. officials in the past about as well, just asked them, and essentially it's not so much a formal change as much as an acknowledgement that they cannot formally change things right now. This is something that the US has done in the past for special representative level officials, so particularly senior officials who haven't yet gone through the regular approval process. This is something even during the Trump era, the Obama era, this is something that happened. And in the case of Jungkook, what's happening right now is the previous special representative for North Korea, Ambassador Song Kim, retired, leaving a vacancy, and as the next person in line, she has effectively stepped up. So she was deputy special representative. She cannot yet be formally appointed special representative, so she's instead serving as the senior official. This does speak to a wider situation, perhaps in Washington, where at the moment there appears to be a dearth of North Korea-focused officials because it is a lower priority for them compared to some other issues. But in the context of, especially in an election year, it is not going to be a very high priority for them to appoint more North Korea-focused officials. So for now, she's holding the fort.
All right, I'm afraid we'll have to leave it there tonight. Thank you so much, both of you, for making time for us. We appreciate your insights.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
And that brings us to the end of the show. Thank you for watching, and be sure to tune in same time tomorrow to join our conversation. Goodbye for now.